All right, I'm back, and we're talking about map sensors because if you're going to be tuning your engine or doing some type of modifications to your engine, it's really important to know how this sensor works. And so the first steps of understanding what a map sensor is understanding the name, and thankfully the name isn't too complicated. The name pretty much tells us everything about how this sensor works. And so this sensor is a sensor that lives inside of your intake manifold or on the side of your intake manifold, and it measures the absolute air pressure inside your intake manifold. Now, that term absolute air pressure is really important because it helps us to understand the measurements that this sensor is picking up. So a map sensor, it's not just reading boost pressure. A lot of people, when you're walking around at a car meet, you're talking to people, you'll walk up to somebody and you'll ask them like, how much boost is your car running? The map sensor does measure boost pressure, but boost pressure is part of that calculation of absolute pressure. And that term absolute air pressure, that one's actually kind of critical because that's where I see most people getting tripped up when they're trying to understand what the sensor is and what size map sensor they need to put on their engine. Absolute pressure is all of the air pressure that your engine and, well, you yourself are experiencing. So it's not just the boost pressure that you're running, but it includes the normal atmospheric air pressure in the room that you and I are in right now. That is included in absolute pressure. And that definition of absolute pressure really becomes important when we're trying to size our map sensor. So for example, if we go out and grab a 1 bar map sensor, which is the equivalent of 14 psi, a lot of people will mistakenly think, well, this 1 bar map sensor can read 1 bar of boost or 14.5 psi of boost. Unfortunately, that's not really how that works because, like I said, this is the entire range of air pressure that sensor can see all the way down to 0 bar or a negative 14.5 psi. So if you were to grab a 1 bar map sensor, at the end of the day, that map sensor is not going to have the ability to read anything above just normal atmospheric pressure, or in more relevant terms, what that means is our ECU cannot see boost. It cannot see anything above just 0 psi of boost. So if we have a turbocharged engine, supercharged, however our engine is forced inducted, we're going to need to move to a bigger map sensor so that we can get more readout, and that will allow the ECU to be able to see how much positive boost pressure we have on top of our atmospheric pressure. And so now that we know that we have a turbocharged engine, let's say we're making 8 psi, what I would recommend doing is doubling up. We're going to go from a 1 bar map sensor up to a 2 bar map sensor. And so once we go up to that 2 bar map sensor, we now have the ability, or the ECU now has the ability, to be able to read up to 14.5 psi of boost. And so now that we've determined that there is such a thing as having too small of a map sensor, and we've talked about how to make sure that we have the right size map sensor and make sure that we have enough range on our map sensor, the next obvious question is there such a thing as having too big of a map sensor? Well, according to the guys at Engine Labs, it just doesn't matter, like, at all. But just because the guys at Engine Labs say that it doesn't matter, I still would exercise an amount of caution when trying to size my map sensor. I don't think what you should do is just run out and just grab the absolute biggest map sensor that you can find. I feel like that would cause some amounts of tuning issues, and you would run into issues with how the engine is running. The guys from Engine Labs, they are speaking from the perspective of dealing with aftermarket ECUs. And when it comes to dealing with aftermarket ECUs, technology has advanced a long ways. These ECUs, they have a ton of compute power, and if there's gaps on the sensor readout or on the data table that you put into the ECU has enough processing power to be able to interpolate data in between those points, be able to smooth out the curve, and then that way you're not running into like big steps when the sensor's resolution or the sensor's density shrinks down. Now, where I could foresee this being a problem is with a lot of cars, people aren't jumping directly to standalones. They are flashing their factory ECU, and their factory ECU might be 10, 20, 30 years old. Now, when you're talking about an ECU that's that old, it may or may not have the ability to be able to do all that fancy interpolation. It may or may not have the ability to do all that fancy processing. And so I could foresee a situation in which somebody gets too big of a map sensor and the ECU is just not able to keep up. So what I would recommend doing is, let's say you have an engine that's running 8 psi of boost, I would just run a 2-bar map sensor. And then when you're ready to go up to 16 psi, I would just go up to the next size. I wouldn't just go get the absolute biggest map sensor, because I wouldn't want to introduce problems into my system that I can't track down, where I'm just kind of now just running around trying to track down why my engine's running poorly. And it's because my ECU doesn't have the ability to be able to read all this data that's coming out of the map sensor. And so I said two terms there that are kind of important to like being able to understand my point. The resolution for these sensors is fixed. Basically, the resolution is from 0 to 5 volts. So there is a physical limit for the size of data, or basically the bus that the data travels over to the ECU. So if you have a 4-bar map sensor that can read all the way up to like 43 psi, that amount of data still has to fit within 5 volts. And so let's look at a graph here. You can kind of see what I'm talking about. Let's say we're running 10 psi or less, and we're going to compare the sensor readout data of a 2-bar map sensor versus a 4-bar map sensor. And while, yes, the guys at Engine Lab said it doesn't matter, as you can see, there are more points in the data from the 2-bar map sensor. There's just more data there. Compared to the 4-bar map sensor, the data is much more sparse and spread out, because that data has to go all the way up to 43 psi. So the resolution is still the same, because the resolution is the 0 to 5 volts, but the actual density and the readout of the points on that graph is just so much less. I think the best way to describe it is when you're watching a video on your phone, the video looks great on your phone, but then when you throw it up on like a 85-inch TV, it looks all blocky and grainy. Well, it's because it's the same video, it's the same 1080p video, but the pixel density is far less on the bigger screen. And it's the same thing with your map sensor. It's the same resolution, right? But because the data is just stretched out so much more, there's big gaps in between when the sensor reads out. And so, like I said, if you have an ECU that does not have the capability to be able to make an educated guess between here and there, you're going to have a situation where the ECU doesn't know what the engine is actually doing. And in that situation, the engine's just going to run rough, and to me, it's not really worth dealing with that type of headache if you don't have to. And so basically, this is how I would play it. Let's say I'm building an engine that's running 10 pounds of boost. Well, that fits within the sensor range of a 2-bar map sensor. But let's say I do forged rods and pistons and I turn up the boost to 18 psi. Well, I'm now beyond the capability of that 2-bar map sensor, so I would go up to a 3-bar map sensor. I wouldn't immediately jump to a 5-bar map sensor or something like that, because like I said, I don't know that I'm going to get into a situation where I'm creating data that my ECU is not able to interpret. And so that's pretty much it. Like I said, map sensors aren't super complicated. The name pretty much gets you almost all the way there. So like I said, it's just a sensor that goes in your manifold that reads absolute pressure. So just remember that absolute air pressure is all of the air pressure. So it's atmospheric plus boost, not just boost pressure. And then secondly, and maybe optionally, if you ask the guys at Engine Labs, I would also just keep in mind that the larger the sensor capacity, the lower the density of data that is read out to the ECU. And so, yeah, if you like this video, you know what to do. Leave a like, subscribe, all the YouTube things I always forget to tell you guys, and I'll see you in the next one.